Airlines 691, do you hear me? 691, adjust your climb immediately. 69.
This is Captain Anju Khatiwada. 20 years ago, she made an extraordinary choice after losing her husband to these very skies. She became a pilot for the same airline that took her husband's life. But this time, she was bent on avoiding the same fate. What drives someone to follow in the footsteps of tragedy? For Captain Anju Khatiwada, the answer lay in the skies above Nepal. Years earlier, her husband, Deepak Pokharel, had lost his life piloting a Yeti Airlines flight through these treacherous mountains. Rather than turn away from aviation, she made an extraordinary decision to become a pilot herself, eventually commanding the very same airline that had claimed her husband's life. But on January 15, 2023, as she prepared to land Yeti Airlines Flight 691 at a brand new airport, neither she nor her 68 passengers could have known they were about to become part of an unprecedented tragedy, one that would unfold live on social media, transforming from moments of celebration to unimaginable horror in mere seconds. How could a modern aircraft with two highly experienced pilots vanish from the sky in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but a live stream of its final moments? This is the story of how a single, split-second error would transform a routine flight into Nepal's deadliest aviation disaster. This is the story of Flight 691. Flying in the Himalayan nation of Nepal has always presented certain unique challenges. Home to 8 of the world's 10 highest mountains, Nepal possesses terrain of unparalleled ruggedness, which often combines with tricky weather to create downright dangerous flying conditions. In 2009, China offered to fund Pokhara International Airport, a turning point for the long-stalled project. Opening in January 2023, the airport operated under visual flight rules with daytime-only landings. The airlines had to create interim procedures due to high terrain challenges, especially for runway 12, which would soon play a crucial role in our story. Yeti Airlines, while part of Nepal's largest tourism group, carried a troubled legacy. 6 fatal accidents since 2004 had earned them one of the world's worst safety records. Despite this, the new Pokhara International Airport opened as planned on January 1, 2023, with Nepal's Prime Minister arriving to much fanfare aboard the first official flight. Regular operations began immediately, with most aircraft landing straight in from the east on runway 30. 2 weeks later, on the morning of January 15th, 2 pilots arrived at Tribhuvan International Airport to operate Yeti Airlines Flight 691. Their ATR-72 aircraft was nearly at capacity, carrying 4 crew and 68 passengers from 8 different nations. In command was 58-year-old instructor Captain Kamal KC, whose experience spoke volumes. 21,900 flying hours, including 3,300 on the ATR-72. But it was his co-pilot's story that brought a heartbreaking twist to everything that followed. Captain Anju Khatiwada, 44, had accumulated 6,400 flying hours but had never landed at the new Pokhara airport. She was receiving airport familiarization training from KC, though even he had only landed there twice before. The flight progressed smoothly until they reached Pokhara airspace. Air traffic control informed them that runway 30 was in use, the standard arrival runway. But Captain KC had different plans. For reasons that remain unclear, he intended to let Captain Khatiwada fly to runway 12 instead, a maneuver not planned by the airline's operations department. As they descended through 6,500 feet, KC requested and received permission to circle to runway 12. He began briefing Khatiwada on the visual circuit and techniques required, particularly emphasizing the steep final turn they would need to execute. Back in the cabin, Indian passenger Sonu Jaiswal was streaming the view live on Facebook, capturing the smiling faces of his fellow passengers, unaware that he was about to earn a tragic distinction as the first person to livestream a fatal plane crash from inside the plane. Moments after lowering the landing gear, Khatiwada disengaged the autopilot, taking manual control. 5 seconds later, seeking to establish the full landing configuration, she called for the flaps to be set to 30 degrees.
Flaps 30 and descending.
Using his left hand, he instinctively reached for the center pedestal to move the flap lever and inexplicably grabbed the wrong lever entirely. On modern aircraft, every aspect of the design is carefully considered, all the way down to the shapes and positions of each cockpit lever. To avoid confusion, many airplanes have the same set of levers distributed in the same order across the center pedestal between the pilots. Traditionally, jets have the thrust levers on the left. In the middle is the speed brake lever, which activates the speed brakes to slow the plane or increase the descent rate. And on the right is the flap lever, which determines the position of the flaps, used to increase the lift generated by the wings at low speeds during takeoff and landing. But the ATR-72 turboprop adds another layer of complexity. Between the speed brake and flap levers sits an additional set of controls known as condition levers. These levers are unique to turboprop aircraft, controlling the fundamental operating mode of the propellers. On the ATR-72-500, they offer 4 positions: 100% override, auto, feather, and shutoff. Each position dramatically affects how the engines interact with the massive propeller blades spinning just outside. To understand what happened next, we need to grasp how these propellers work. Think of each propeller blade as a wing turned sideways. Just as a wing generates lift by moving through the air at an angle, propeller blades create thrust by biting into the airflow. The angle at which they bite, called the blade pitch, is crucial. At 0 degrees, the blades take no bite at all, producing no thrust. As the angle increases, so does the thrust, up to an optimal point. But there's one more position. If you turn the blades 90 degrees, they generate no thrust at all, instead slicing cleanly through the air with minimal drag. This position is called feather, and it's typically only used when an engine has failed. Now, picture the scene in Flight 691's cockpit. When Casey heard Khatiwada call for flaps 30, he reached over with his left hand, not his usual right, and without looking, grabbed what he thought was the flap lever. But his hand had found the condition levers instead. In one fluid motion, he pulled them both straight back to the feather position. This meant the engines weren't able to provide sufficient thrust. This single action, lasting less than a second, would seal their fate. But remarkably, neither pilot realized what had just happened. They were about to experience one of aviation's most insidious threats, the deadly combination of assumption and distraction. As the condition levers moved to feather, the engines began their silent betrayal. In these critical moments, both pilots were distracted by the landing checklist, missing warnings that could have saved them. The flap position indicator should have shown 15 degrees, as the flaps hadn't actually been extended. Neither pilot questioned this discrepancy. Khatiwada sensed something wasn't right as the aircraft's performance changed.
Power's not responding normally.
Continue approach.
She did what any pilot would do: add power to compensate for what she assumed was increased drag from the flaps. But her actions were futile. With the propellers now feathered, the engine sat at idle power, unable to respond. Even if they could produce more torque, the blade position meant no meaningful thrust could be generated. What followed was a tragic example of how assumptions can blind us to reality. Khatiwada kept adjusting power levers that could no longer help them, while both pilots remained fixated on their landing preparations, missing the bigger picture that was rapidly unfolding around them. The situation got worse with frightening speed. Just 4 seconds after the props feathered, the engine spooled down. When the RPM dropped too low to power the aircraft's AC generators, a caution chime rang out and 2 warning lights illuminated on the dashboard. Khatiwada noticed and mentioned these alerts, but Casey offered no response. The DC electrical system kept their vital systems running, but these crucial warnings went unacknowledged as both pilots focused on other tasks. As this was happening, Khatiwada began the left turn onto the base leg, lining up with what she thought was the old Pokhara runway. As the aircraft banked steeply left, the automated voice called out,
500!
Indicating they were now just 500 feet above the ground. In what would prove to be another critical oversight, one of the pilots silenced the master caution without discussion, dismissing another warning that could have forced them to reassess their situation. Still unaware of their true predicament, Khatiwada focused on the turn.
How long should we maintain the bank angle? Should we continue descending?
Hold on, just a little further. Pull up now.
Captain, should we consider lowering our altitude?
No, absolutely not. We need more thrust. Throw on full power.
691, adjust your climb immediately.
She complied, once again moving the now useless power levers. It was a desperate attempt to control their destiny, but with the propellers feathered, the engines couldn't respond. Only then, 20 seconds after Casey had called for flaps 30, did he actually move the flap lever to the correct position. Did he finally realize his earlier mistake? If he did, he never mentioned it. He didn't question what Khatiwada had done earlier, nor did he acknowledge the growing crisis. By now, precious altitude and airspeed were bleeding away. The aircraft was silently falling from the sky, powerless, while inside the cockpit, a deadly silence persisted between the 2 pilots. Then came their final, desperate gambit, attempting a steep turn onto the final approach at just 368 feet above the ground. The investigation would never definitively determine whether Khatiwada made this decision independently or acted on Casey's guidance. Perhaps, finding themselves without engine power and hemmed in by mountains in a densely populated valley, completing the turn to land seemed like their only option. But it was a perilous gamble. A steep turn at low speed demands more lift, which depends entirely on airspeed. Without sufficient speed, the aircraft risks losing altitude, or worse, stalling completely if the angle of attack becomes too steep. Despite these risks, they began the turn. As their airspeed continued to decay, their tenuous control slipped away. Then, in a moment of mounting panic, Khatiwada called out to KC, desperately pleading for him to take control, repeating,
The engines have no power.
Casey did take over, but there was no time left for him to assess or recover. Seconds later, the stick shaker activated, violently vibrating the controls to warn of an imminent stall. The aircraft, barely maintaining lift, plummeted from 311 feet to 200 feet in just seconds. Casey attempted to level the wings, but in doing so, he raised the nose, a fatal mistake that robbed them of what little airspeed remained. From a balcony below, a resident in Pokhara filmed the aircraft's final struggle, its nose pitched high in a desperate attempt to remain airborne. Just 9 seconds after Casey took control, the left wing stalled, sealing their fate. The ATR-72 plunged toward the earth. It was the culmination of a cascade of errors, misjudgments, and a cruel shortage of time, a tragedy unfolding in real time. As the left wing ceased to generate lift, the aircraft banked dramatically leftward, rolling past 90 degrees and inverting in mere seconds. From their perilously low altitude, recovery was impossible. In a chilling epitaph to a flight gone wrong, Sonu Jaiswal's livestream captured a chorus of panicked shouts amid blurred images of seats and walls, followed by the sound of impact, a few frames of darkness, and finally, an eruption of scorching flames. Yeti Airlines Flight 691 struck the brush-covered banks of the Seti Gandaki River in a devastating left-wing low attitude. The violence of the impact scattered debris across both sides of the gorge, with parts of the aircraft remaining perched atop the cliff, while the main fuselage plunged into the canyon below. All 72 souls aboard perished, making this Nepal's deadliest aviation disaster. Local residents rushed to the crash site, drawn by the explosion and the fire consuming the nearby brush, but hope quickly gave way to grim reality. The cause, tragically, came down to a simple but fatal error. In the ATR-72's cockpit, the condition levers controlling engine power sit close to the flap controls. When Casey reached with his left hand to adjust the flaps, instead of his usual right, he grabbed the wrong lever without looking. This single action, lasting mere seconds, sealed their fate. The final investigation revealed that both pilots missed multiple warnings that could have saved them. But perhaps most crucially, the pilots weren't given proper training for the challenging runway 12 approach procedure. One mistake, combined with inadequate preparation and missed opportunities to recover, led to the loss of 72 lives, a stark reminder that in aviation, even small errors can have devastating consequences. Regardless, 72 people lost their lives, and such crashes should be a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry globally. Small mistakes and oversights are unforgiving. With that, it's time to end today's video. Subscribe for more, and see you in the next one.